in the northeastern quarter of Africa. The White Nile slows before its final run to the sea. Dawn arrives here in layers, gray light first, then gold, catching smoke over the water and cattle tracks worn soft by centuries of walking. Herders kneel beside their cattle in that light. Warm water spills over their hair and shoulders like a blessing older than memory itself. Inside the hush of camp smoke, something astonishing comes into view. These men are tall, among the tallest people anywhere on Earth. Yet almost no one beyond this river has ever whispered their names. Their home is younger than the phone in your pocket. Their blood has walked this same Nile for thousands of years. Its name is South Sudan. Its story begins here, not on a map, but in the people who never needed one. As the light climbs over the tree line, the smoke begins to loosen its grip, and the camp opens itself to the day. Dozens of boys, none older than 10, kneel beside their own cattle. Small hands work pale ash into hide until it gleams like brushed pewter under the rising sun. Among them is a boy named Deng, muttering his favorite cow's name under his breath, the way another child might hum a lullaby. Not one of them looks up. They have done this every morning of their lives, and their fathers did the same before them. It stopped feeling like a lesson generations ago. Now it simply feels like breathing. But how does a body grow this tall, year after year, on nothing more than milk, motion, and open sky? Scientists have chased that question through the Dinka people for decades. The answer is woven rather than singular. Genetics lays the first thread. A childhood spent almost entirely on dairy, and unbroken walking weaves in the rest. Studies have recorded average adult male height above 6 feet, with some men measured well beyond it. Alongside the Tutsi of neighboring Rwanda, the Dinka are widely considered among the tallest people in Africa, and by some measures, on the whole planet. One name carries that truth further than any statistic ever could. Manute Bol was born in a Dinka village not far from here. He grew to stand 7 feet 7 inches tall, the tallest player in the history of the NBA. His son, Bol Bol, now plays professional basketball an ocean away. Between father and son stretches an entire journey, a cattle camp, an American arena. A bloodline that has refused, so far, to bend. Height, though, is only the surface of what these families carry. Ask Deng his own name, and half the time he still answers with the name of his favorite cow instead. Long before he belongs to any family, he already belongs to a herd, already tied to an animal that will help decide how the world sees him for the rest of his life. Follow that same height into the crowded streets of Juba and watch it move differently. It slips past motorbikes, ducks beneath market awnings, rises above a skyline, still finding its shape, one storefront at a time. It is tempting to mistake the camp and the capital for two different centuries. They are not. They are the same people, carrying the same inheritance down two very different roads. Some carry it even further. Each summer, A national basketball team called the Bright Stars gathers players from camps, cities, and a scattered diaspora, as though a nation with almost nothing else in abundance somehow grows height the way other countries grow rain. Just 6 years after playing their first official game, they qualified in 2023 for the 2024 Paris Olympics, the youngest nation in the world, reaching the Games in a sport their people seem almost destined for. For a few short weeks, it was one of the only headlines about South Sudan that had nothing to do with war. And yet, for everything that height gives them, the courts, the record books, the way a crowd instinctively parts, it is not the tallest measurement that defines these people. It is what they kneel beside every single morning, long before the rest of the world has even opened its eyes. So what could possibly make a man kneel before an animal every day of his life and call it devotion instead of duty? The answer arrives with the first true light, in a gesture most outsiders mistake for strangeness before they understand it as tenderness. A young man positions himself beneath a cow and lets her warm stream wash down his hair, his shoulders, the length of his back. He does not flinch. He is not performing for anyone. To the Mundari, this is simply care, no more dramatic than a mother checking a child's forehead for fever. The ammonia is believed to guard against infection and, as a quiet reward, to tint the hair a burnt copper that marks a man as one of their own. Stand close enough at dusk, and you can hear the horns clack together like wind chimes tuned to something older than music, a sound that has drifted along this stretch of the Nile for longer than anyone here can trace. Nearby, children gather the dung left behind overnight, stack it into low mounds, and set it alight. The smoke that lifts from those fires is not waste. It is protection, chasing mosquitoes from the herd and the people sleeping pressed against it. When the flames soften into embers, the ash becomes almost everything else a family might need: sunscreen, medicine for a wound, even, in a pinch, a rough kind of toothpaste. Nothing that rises from that fire goes unused. For the Mundari and the Dinka, a cow is never property in the ordinary sense, the way a house or a bicycle might be elsewhere. It is closer to kin, a relative who happens to walk on hooves. A prized bull, its horns, sometimes stretching wider than a grown man's open arms, carries a name of its own, a place near the fire reserved for almost no one else. When a man marries, the price is paid not in coins but in cattle, sometimes 40 animals walked over in a single breathing declaration of what the marriage is worth. But what happens once that fire dies down? Once the horns fall silent, the dust does not stay quiet for long. By afternoon, that same patch of ground becomes a wrestling ring. Bodies still pale with morning ash grip and throw one another in matches that double as rites of passage, watched by fathers who once stood inside that same circle themselves. It is not violence. It is memory, rehearsing itself out loud, year after year, until a younger man finally earns the right to take an older one's place. Even the cattle carry the weight of this devotion. Ankole Watusi bulls, prized above every other breed, wear horns that can stretch nearly 2 meters from tip to tip, shaped over centuries until their curve looks less like biology and more like sculpture. Herders massage them with ash twice a day, polish their horns with a paste of ash and urine, and speak of them less like livestock and more like elders who happen to graze. None of this looks like wealth, not by any measure the world beyond the camp would recognize. An ordinary bull might sell for a few $100s, the finest for many times that, sums that mean little set against a country where most households survive on less than $1 a day. But value here was never counted only in money, and it would be a mistake to read the poverty itself as some kind of scenery. It is counted in what a cow can still give a family with almost nothing else, and in what a people will still defend, sometimes with a rifle where a spear once stood. A culture rooted this deeply in land and animal has to come from somewhere, and it is not only these camps that grew it. It is an entire country, one that, depending on how you measure it, is either impossibly old or barely old enough to walk on its own, and how young it really is only becomes clear once you see what that country has had to survive to stay standing. Impossibly old, and barely old enough to walk. Both of those truths folded into a single afternoon on July 9, 2011, when crowds filled the streets of Juba to watch a flag climb into the sky for the very first time. 98.83% of voters had chosen this exact moment months earlier, in one of the most decisive independence referendums the modern world has ever recorded. By nightfall, South Sudan had become the youngest country on earth. It remains so today. Even the flag is older than the nation it now represents. It was designed in 2005, during the peace talks that finally ended decades of war, and it waited 6 patient years to fly over a country that had not yet been born. Somewhere in that long wait between symbol and statehood sits much of what defines South Sudan, an identity that arrived long before the walls built to hold it. One afternoon of celebration could never undo everything that came before it. Landlocked, hemmed in by 6 neighbors, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic, the nation sits at a crossroads it has never quite finished settling into. At some checkpoints, the border between one authority and the next is nothing more than a rope strung across a dirt road, held by a soldier barely older than the country he serves. A checkpoint built from rope is still a checkpoint. More than 60 ethnic groups share this stretch of land, each carrying its own language, its own memory, its own claim on the soil beneath that young flag. Independence did not arrive gently. It followed 2 long civil wars against the North, the second stretching 22 brutal years and costing an estimated 2 million lives. And peace, once won, did not hold for long. Barely 2 years after that flag climbed the sky, political rivalries tore the young government apart from within, dragging the country back into a conflict it is still trying to walk itself out of. In Bor, along the Nile in Jonglei State, the oldest residents remember both wars, the one fought against Khartoum, and the one that came after, fought among their own. Ask what they felt the day the flag went up, and the answer rarely comes simple. Pride, almost always, arrives first, then a pause, then, quietly, the confession of fear for whatever might come next. That same ache, celebration, tangled together with worry, does not stay locked inside a single memory. It runs straight into the rhythm of daily life itself, a rhythm that has never answered to the government in Juba or the calendar on any wall, only to whatever the sky decides to do next. Rain decides almost everything here, or more precisely, its absence does. Life moves on two clocks, and neither one is a watch. From December through February, the dry season pulls families deeper into the wetlands, chasing grazing land and fish toward islands that exist for only half the year. Round huts rise on ground that will vanish again within months, built to be temporary because permanence was never really the point. In a Mundari camp, the day begins before the sky finds its color. Dung is gathered, fires are lit, cattle are milked, while smoke still hangs low enough to touch. By mid-morning, the herd drifts out toward open grass, Dung and the other boys trailing behind animals many times their size. Elsewhere, this might be called a chore. Here, it feels closer to inheritance. When the rains return in March, the pattern reverses. Families pull back toward higher ground near the savanna, following water they no longer need to chase. For a while, the wetlands that sheltered them belong to someone else again, to the fish, the birds, the crocodiles that turn an ordinary bath into a calculated risk. Night carries its own labor. Men often sleep beside the herd rather than inside any shelter, guarding cattle from predators and, more and more, from other people. Spend one night out there, and you understand why rest in a cattle camp is never guaranteed. It comes in shifts, one eye always turned toward the dark. In Juba, this same rhythm barely resembles itself. Motorbike taxis weave through market crowds. Vendors call out prices in a currency that seems to lose weight by the week. And yet the pull of the herd never fully lets go. Many families in the capital still send their sons back to the camps every dry season, unwilling to let a generation grow up without learning to read the land the way their grandfathers did. Two rhythms, one country. And somewhere beyond both of them waits a landscape so vast, so wild, it makes even the busiest camp look small beside it. From above, the Sudd does not look like a swamp so much as a green wound spreading slowly across the land. It is a maze of papyrus channels and floating islands, stretched across roughly 57,000 square kilometers of the White Nile basin. Fly low enough over it, and you lose all sense of direction within minutes. The reeds close in from every side like a tide with no shoreline. It is one of the largest wetlands on Earth, and for most of human history, it was nearly impossible to cross. Ancient Egyptian expeditions never made it through. Roman soldiers, sent south by Emperor Nero in the year 61, turned back at its edge. Slave traders, colonial explorers, entire armies, one after another, met the same wall of reeds, and one after another gave up. The Sudd takes its name from the Arabic word for barrier, and for 2,000 years, it has more than earned it. And yet, inside that same barrier, life does not merely survive. It thrives, in numbers few outsiders have ever imagined. Each year, roughly 1.3 million antelope, white-eared kob, tiang, and Mongala gazelle move across the Sudd and neighboring Boma National Park in one of the largest overland mammal migrations left on the planet, rivaling the far more famous one in the Serengeti. almost nobody outside South Sudan has ever heard of it. Somewhere in that same maze of water and grass, a shoebill stork stands motionless for hours, beak angled toward the surface, waiting for a lungfish to rise within range. With its prehistoric silhouette, it looks like something that should have vanished millions of years ago. It has not. To the south, Nimule National Park holds elephants that still move in family herds despite decades of conflict around them. Farther east, Mount Kinyeti climbs past 3,000 meters, the highest point in a country most outsiders picture only as flat, flooded plains. During the darkest years of civil war, the Sudd gave something far more valuable than scenery. Tens of thousands fled into its channels to escape the violence, hiding among the very same reeds that once stopped Roman legions. A wetland built by nature to keep outsiders out became, for its own people, a place to disappear into and survive. A landscape this generous should, in theory, be able to feed the people who live closest to it. For the most part, it cannot. The reason is not floating anywhere on the surface. It is buried, deep underground, in a resource that was supposed to be South Sudan's greatest fortune. Beneath that same soil sits one of the richest oil reserves in East Africa, the kind of discovery that, on paper, should have made this one of the wealthier young nations on the continent. So why has it not? The answer travels through pipelines that never touch South Sudanese soil after leaving it. Oil accounts for more than 90% of government revenue, yet under 10% of actual economic output, because nearly every barrel journeys north through pipelines running straight across Sudan, the very country South Sudan fought a war to leave behind. That single dependency has proven catastrophic more than once. When conflict in Sudan disrupted the pipeline in 2024, South Sudan lost an estimated $7 million a day in export revenue. Salaries went unpaid for months. Prices climbed as the currency buckled underneath them. A national economy built on a resource meant to guarantee independence turned out to depend on the goodwill of the very neighbor it had just walked away from. Outside wall, a farmer works soil that ranks among the most fertile in the region, far more arable land per person than most of its neighbors can claim. And yet, more than 80% of South Sudanese households still farm mainly to feed themselves rather than to sell, because the roads, storage, and markets needed to move a surplus crop simply do not exist across most of the country. In Juba's markets, that fragility is impossible to miss. Vendors recalculate prices by the week, sometimes by the day, as the local currency slides against the dollar. Buy the same sack of grain twice in a single year, and you may pay triple the second time. Customers count out bills that seem to buy a little less with every visit. Wealth here was never handed out by accident. It has been shaped, and just as often shattered, by decisions made far from the cattle camps and market stalls that depend on it most. And nowhere does that fragility land harder than at the dinner table, where, against every economic collapse thrown its way, the country's oldest source of food has somehow, stubbornly, refused to disappear. A woman kneels beside a cow at first light, guiding milk into a wooden container, with hands that no longer need to watch what they are doing. Nearby, a man presses a blunted arrow gently against a cow's neck vein, draws a small measure of blood, and stirs it into a shared bowl of milk. Watch closely, and you will notice how little seems to trouble the animal at all. Within days, the wound has closed on its own, as though nothing ever happened. Among cattle-keeping communities, cows are rarely slaughtered for meat, saved instead for weddings and the rare major ceremony, because a living cow keeps giving for years, while a dead one gives only once. Milk and blood, taken without ending a life, form the quiet backbone of a diet built on patience rather than consumption. Patience has its limits. In the months when even patience runs out, when the herds thin and the milk stops coming, the diet has to widen. Away from the camps, sorghum and maize carry that same weight for farming communities, ground down and boiled into a thick porridge eaten at nearly every meal. Along the Nile, fishermen cast their nets into the current at dusk, pulling in the protein cattle cannot always provide, especially in the driest stretches of the year. And in the hardest years of all, during floods, during hunger that outruns every harvest, some families have had no choice but to dig water lily bulbs from the swamp floor and grind them into a bitter, starchy stand-in for grain. It is not a delicacy. It is survival, quietly wearing the shape of a recipe. What holds this food culture together was never variety. It is restraint, a philosophy passed down through generations that a cow, given something today, can still be giving 20 years from now, if only you let it live long enough to keep giving. That same patience, that same refusal to take more than necessary, is now being tested by forces no cow, however carefully tended, could ever stand against. For generations, cattle raiding between rival communities was carried out with spears, dangerous, but limited by what a spear alone could do. That changed the moment automatic rifles flooded into the region during decades of war. What once ended in bruises and broken bones now sometimes ends in massacres, whole camps lost in a single night over animals that were never truly stolen so much as passed violently from one grieving family to another. The economics behind the violence have only made things worse. As inflation drives up the price of a bride paid in cattle, the temptation to steal a herd rather than slowly build one grows harder to resist. A tradition once rooted in honor has, in the wrong hands, curdled into something closer to warfare. Nature has not been any gentler. South Sudan has endured 6 consecutive years of severe flooding, displacing hundreds of thousands of people in 2025 alone. Around Bentiu, entire villages sit partly submerged for months at a stretch, homes built from mud and thatch dissolving faster than families can rebuild them. Entire neighborhoods stay waist-deep in water that never fully receded, families cooking meals on rooftops because the ground beneath them no longer exists. Crops drown before harvest, livestock sicken and die in water meant to sustain them. What the floods do not destroy outright, they starve slowly instead. Nearly 2/3 of the population, close to 8 million people, now face severe hunger, with tens of thousands living in conditions the United Nations classifies as catastrophic. And here is the detail that outweighs almost every statistic already mentioned. Decades ago, when war and famine first tore through these communities, researchers who had once measured Dinka men among the tallest human beings on the planet recorded something unexpected. Sons were coming of age shorter than their fathers, not because the bloodline had changed, but because hunger and displacement had stunted a generation before it ever had the chance to stand at its full height. Growth, undone by hunger, a birthright, quietly rewritten. Dung, older now, stands close to the spot where his own father once stood at his age, and does not quite reach him. Beneath nearly all of it runs the same fragile artery, already traced through this story, an economy so dependent on a single pipeline that one disruption abroad can empty a granary at home. Poverty here was never the absence of resources. It is what happens when abundant resources keep slipping through a system too fragile to ever fully hold on to them. By almost any outside measure, this should be a place people leave behind. So why, after everything, do so many of them stay? Ask South Sudanese people that very question, even in the darkest years, and the answer comes back close to unanimous. Are you proud to call yourself South Sudanese? Survey after survey finds pride here running higher than almost anywhere else on the continent, even as more than half admit they do not feel safe speaking openly about politics. Every July 9th, Juba fills again, not with the raw disbelief of 2011, but with something steadier, something closer to muscle memory. Families in traditional dress dance beside soldiers in uniform. Children too young to remember the war sing songs written before they were born. The flag that waited 6 years to fly is, by now, simply part of the sky. Away from the crowds, quieter stories carry the same weight. Families displaced by flooding return, again and again, to rebuild on the same waterlogged ground, rather than start over, somewhere drier and safer. Ask why, and the answer rarely comes complicated. This is where the ancestors are buried. This is the herd's grazing land. This is, simply, where they are from. And in a cattle camp not far from where this story began, a newborn calf is given a name. The same tradition that once gave Dung the name he still answers to, half the time, before his own. Land, cattle, and lineage, braided into a single unbroken thread that war, flooding, and poverty have bent again and again, but never once managed to cut. So return, one last time, to the question that opened this video. Why does almost no one outside these borders know this story at all? Maybe the truest answer is that South Sudan was never waiting to be discovered. The sun still drops low over the Nile, turning the water the color of the ash that covers the herder's skin. Somewhere in that procession walks Deng, no longer a boy, leading his own cattle home the way his father once led him, their shadows stretching across ground that has seen war, flood, and independence, sometimes all within the same decade. Somewhere behind him, smoke rises from a fire being rebuilt for what feels like the 100th time. This country was never handed the easy version of statehood. It was given a flag before it was ready, a border before it was safe, and a fortune buried underground it has barely managed to keep. And still, on the same soil that has raised the tallest people on earth for as long as anyone can remember, families keep returning, keep naming, keep standing. Perhaps that has been the answer all along. Not that life here is easy, but that no one here has ever found a reason good enough to leave it behind. If one image from this video has stayed with you, the ash, the height, the rope stretched across a road, tell us in the comments which one it was. And if you'd like more stories like South Sudan's to reach people who've never had the chance to see them, following this channel is the easiest way to help that happen.